Hi everyone, my name is Yasser Said. I will be talking in this presentation about monitoring of hemodynamics in sick infants. So the model of physiologic assessment of hemodynamics should be considered assessment of three important organs in our body: respiratory system, cardiovascular system, and in between you have the blood. And the blood is not just the hemoglobin and the number of hemoglobin concentration. It is a relationship between hemoglobin and oxygen, represented as oxygen dissociation curve. Respiratory system is a system responsible to maintain normal oxygen saturation and the pressure gradient in the blood. And any problem with the saturation might be presented as hypoxemia, and the hypoxemia by definition is the saturation less than 80%, as per the Canadian oxygen trial. To assess the respiratory system, we need an idea about oxygen in histograms, FiO2, mean airway pressure, and ventilation-related monitoring parameters like respiratory rate histogram, and the tidal CO2 as histogram as well, over a period of time, 24 hours or 8 hours or whatever time that you think that the infant was started to be unstable. The compliance of the lung, resistance of the lung, and you can get that from the conventional ventilation. Pressure volume curves, flow volume curves, and you can get these curves from the ventilation. For the mechanical ventilation, the conventional mechanical ventilation. Transthoracic pressure difference that can be assumed or calculated based on other parameters, but that's actually not the focus of our talk today. Blood gases, we need to assess acid-base status, base deficit versus wide anion gap acidosis, oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, and the hemoglobin concentration. So we need to assess the blood gases in more physiologic details. Blood flow, we need to get the blood pressure, but the blood pressure not as a fixed number reflected as mean arterial pressure. We need to understand the relationship between systole, diastole, and the physiologic translation of these numbers as a trend and as histograms, not just as number at a specific time. Heart rate, perfusion index, tissue oxygen represented by the near-field spectroscopy machine, and the calculation of oxygen delivery and urine output. So we need really detailed assessment of the hemodynamics to get an idea about the oxygen delivery and if there is any decompensation of the compensatory mechanisms at the end organ level, represented by the conclusion of all of these parameters. So the integrated approach is integrating different parameters to assess the autoregulation. It's all the more detailed assessment, and you can predict any decompensation in real time before development of anaerobic metabolism and the definite decompensation at the end. So if you're able to monitor all of these parameters in time, you may detect early the decompensation. So what's normal hemodynamics? Hemodynamics is integrated ability of cardiovascular dynamics, respiratory physiology to maintain normal saturation of the hemoglobin and also normal pressure of oxygen in the plasma, oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, and the autoregulatory mechanisms of the specific organs like brain, kidney, any other organs to maintain normal blood flow in spite of the fluctuation of the blood pressure. So that's a definition. My definition of normal hemodynamics is integrated ability of all of these systems is not just blood pressure or heart rate. And it is maintaining oxygen delivery enough to maintain normal organ functions. So we're not waiting until you get organ dysfunction. We can detect early by detailed monitoring of any sick infants the early stages of decompensation or compromised hemodynamics at the stage of compromised autoregulation very early before development of anaerobic metabolism. Monitoring hemodynamics and vital signs at the bedside. It can be in multiple forms. It can be reporting vitals on regular intervals. That's most widely used and unfortunately the least helpful at the bedside. So the physician or the bedside nurse will report the heart rate, blood pressure in certain intervals, like every 30 minutes, every 1 hour, and then detect the trend. That's the least helpful way of assessment of hemodynamics. Or assessment of vital waves, like heart rate variability or blood pressure as waves. Or reporting vitals as histograms. So histograms will give you an idea about the calculated percentage of the different ranges of heart rate, blood pressure over the 24 hours or a specific time. And you may know exactly how much time the infant had blood pressure lower than expected or lower than normal, or within normal or above normal for all of the vital signs. So that's a very helpful tool. Reporting vitals as trends. So that will be our focus today. So we'll discuss how to report the blood pressure, how to detect the changes in the blood pressure based on the trend and the continuous trend. And we need for that the direct measurement or invasive measurement of the blood pressure. Indirect can be used, but is not as reliable as the direct invasive blood pressure assessment. Reporting vitals as trend integrated. So integrating blood pressure with other parameters like near-field spectroscopy. So we'll get an idea about the autoregulation window. Reporting the CO2 variation with the near-field spectroscopy, also the tissue oxygenation. Also we'll get an idea about how can the CO2 variation above normal or washing CO2 affect the blood brain oxygen delivery and the blood flow in the brain. Today we'll focus on number 4, the blood pressure trends. Main objectives of this presentation to demonstrate physiology of blood flow and vascular resistance, pathophysiology or pathophysiologic categories of circulatory shock represented as blood pressure trends, clinical categories of circulatory shock, the physiologic-based approach, management of abnormal blood pressure, and I did not consider abnormal blood pressure as hypotension. That's one of the wrong concepts, because abnormal blood pressure in units can be high blood pressure. Okay, so we are talking about abnormal blood pressure trends. You may have very sick infants with high resistance and high diastolic blood pressure, and heart get very compromised with low stroke volume, and you may not detect that until you have very high lactic acid, because you just keep relying on the mean blood pressure, which in this situation will be normal or even above the normal range. So just to describe simply the cardiovascular system and as like different categories or different compartments. The first compartment in the cardiovascular system, the pump system, which is the heart. So the heart is contracting to create a pressure, and this pressure is above the basic pressure in the circulation, which is the diastolic pressure. So the heart should create by the contraction the systolic pressure, which is exceeding the diastolic pressure, and this pressure should be enough to eject the stroke volume out of the heart. And the stroke volume will be typically and should be equal to the venous return, or what the heart is getting should be equal what the heart is pumping out to the circulation. So the baseline pressure is the diastolic pressure, and the pressure created by the heart is the systolic pressure. And actually, with the next compartment, the larger arteries, you will recognize that even the diastolic pressure is created by the heart. How? So when the heart contracts, created the systolic pressure, the large arteries, including aorta and large branches, will dilate and expand because of the elastic recoil or the elastic property of the arteries. So the large arteries will expand, and this expansion will absorb some of the energy from the systolic contraction of the heart, and this energy will be used in the elastic recoil. So the large artery will recoil back based on this restored energy, and this recoil will create the diastolic pressure. And this diastolic pressure will be propagated into arterioles, and the pressure will be maintained. The diastolic pressure will be maintained with the normal range in the arterioles, because the media of the arterioles reaching the muscular fibers, and this musculosa and arterioles will be sensitive to any changes. The beta and alpha receptors in these muscle fibers will make the arterioles contract or relax to maintain the systemic vascular resistance within normal, and to avoid any significant changes, fluctuation in the diastolic blood pressure or mean blood pressure. So back to the larger arteries reaching elastic fibers, making the elastic recoil very easy and creating the diastolic pressure. So if we assume that the aorta and large artery is very stiff and there is no elastic recoil, systole will be very high, extremely high, and diastole will be almost zero. So the elastic property of the large arteries will maintain the narrow normal difference between the diastolic pressure and systolic pressure, fixed normal and fixed under fixed normal condition. And the systemic vascular resistance is a function of arterioles, not large arteries. So in the arterioles, because of the media reaching muscle fibers, will contract and relax to maintain systemic vascular resistance within normal range, which will be reflected on diastolic pressure. So the systemic vascular resistance will be reflected mainly on diastolic pressure. Now we have a conclusion that the systolic pressure of the heart is reflecting mainly venous return or stroke volume, and also is reflecting how powerful the heart is to contract and create the systolic pressure. Because of the heart, if the heart is weak, cannot contract, then the systole will be low. And this poor contraction can be due to the weak heart by itself, like cardiomyopathy, or high systemic vascular resistance. Heart cannot contract to overcome the resistance. So this overcome of the resistance, we call it afterload. So the heart overcomes the resistance to create the systolic pressure, we call that afterload. Then we'll come to the capillaries. Capillaries, there is no muscular media, there is no elastic fibers, there is fenestration of the wall, and it's very easy for the nutrition and the oxygen to diffuse through capillaries. That's an exchange apparatus. But some of the fluids will escape into the interstitial tissues, which should be drained through the lymphatics back to the circulation. And next we have the veins. Veins, they are the most compliant part in the circulation, and they are the capacitance part of the circulation. And at the same time, because of that, the veins are the reservoir for the blood. Typically, the blood volume in the body divided into 85% in the veins and 15% everywhere else. So 15% in the heart and the larger arteries, arterioles, capillaries, and 85%, 80 to 85% in the veins. The veins are very compliant, and if you infuse extra volume of blood or fluid, can be stored easily in the veins because of the high compliance. Now I will be talking about the trends of blood pressure. We have in our body systolic and diastolic blood pressures, which should be evaluated when you interested to evaluate the hemodynamics status. Mean blood pressure is just one single number to make your life easier, but does not reflect the physiologic details of the hemodynamics. So as we described before, systolic blood pressure is a pressure created by ventricular contractile function to exceed vascular resistance. So exceeding vascular resistance by the heart means afterload. So the heart is creating this pressure to overcome resistance, and this by definition in the physiology means afterload. This pressure is needed to push certain volume of blood, stroke volume, through the cardiovascular system. And the stroke volume in units, by the way, it's about 1 to 2 ml per single heartbeat. If you multiply that by the heart rate, you will get the cardiac output. So 1 to 2 ml multiplied by average heart rate of 150, you get to a result of 150 to 300, which is a normal cardiac output per minute. What about diastolic blood pressure? It is the resistance by contractile property of arterioles, systemic vascular resistance. To begin with, we understood that diastolic blood pressure is initially created by the energy stored in the large arterioles, stored in the elastic recoil, but propagated and maintained all over the circulation. So the lowest blood pressure detected in the arterial compartment at any time should be the diastolic blood pressure, maintained because of the systemic vascular resistance, which is a function of the arterioles. The systemic vascular resistance is very important to maintain movement and propagation of the pressure and propagation of the blood throughout the circulation back to the heart. So maintaining a gradient between arterial and venous side. If the systemic vascular resistance lost, it means that the blood will be stagnant in the arterial compartment and the propagation will be much less. The diastolic blood pressure is reflecting resistance and the intravascular volume. So you have significant depletion of intravascular volume, the total volume, the diastolic blood pressure might drop. But you need significant hemorrhage, significant loss of the volume to be represented by diastolic blood pressure. Why? Because in normal conditions, and even under stress and with loss of significant volume of blood, and all of these conditions, the body will compensate by increasing the resistance to maintain diastolic blood pressure. So you need really very, very significant amount of blood lost or significant dehydration to have the diastolic pressure affected. But most of the condition, the body will compensate by increasing the resistance to maintain the diastolic blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure can be reflecting venous return, as we mentioned, myocardial performance, and stroke volume. And I keep repeating that because that's very important to understand. What the systolic blood pressure mean at the bedside, and what the diastolic blood pressure reflecting. On the other hand, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure is reflecting systemic vascular resistance and overall vascular volume. So to make it easy, diastolic blood pressure is reflecting overall body vascular volume. Systolic blood pressure is just reflecting the stroke volume or venous return, which is really small volume. Again, 1 to 2 ml per kg per 1 beat, cardiac cycle, 1 cardiac cycle. Then what about the mean blood pressure and pulse pressures? Mean blood pressure is a calculated number and can be assessed by the machine, and it can be given as a number, but it is roughly can be calculated as 1/3 of the systole, 2/3 of diastole. And why 2/3 of the diastole? Because the diastolic blood pressure representing longer time in the cardiac cycle, almost double the time of the systolic blood pressure. So the impact of diastolic blood pressure on the circulation and perfusion is more than the systolic blood pressure. And I have seen a lot of sick infants, systolic blood pressure is almost equal to diastolic, and blood pressure is almost zero, and the infant stayed alive for a period of time. Pulse pressure is the magnitude of stroke volume. How much pulse pressure considered to be normal? Roughly, it is about 15 millimeter mercury for the first day of life or more. 20 millimeter mercury beyond the first day of life for most of the premature and term infants. And with more maturation, you'll get this number higher, close to 30 millimeter mercury, with the when the preterm infants is close to term. So it is increasing with the gestational age. Pulse pressure can be low with poor contractility or low preload or low stroke volume, and we'll talk about that in more details. Wide pulse pressure if you have significant left to right shunt. So simply, if you have heart exposed to high preload due to left to right shunt, like in PDA, the left ventricle is dilated, and when the left ventricle is dilated, then as per Starling law, the contractility will be more strong. So the contraction and the creation of systolic blood pressure will be more than expected because of the Starling law. You have more volume, so you have more hyperdynamic contraction of the heart. And this contraction will cause, as we mentioned before, more recoil of the elastic fibers in the aorta. So the diastole will be more exaggerated, but most of the blood will escape through the large ductus arteriosus. That's why the reflection of the diastole on the systemic circulation will be less, and diastole will be much less because the blood is already escaped through the PDA to the pulmonary circulation. That's why you have a big discrepancy between systole and the diastole in case of left to right shunt PDA. Next, I will discuss regulation of venous return and cardiac output and the relationship between both. And I have 5 main patterns of relationship, 1 normal and 4 pathophysiologic patterns. The relationship between venous return and cardiac output. So we have in this graph the venous return represented as a red curve, and the cardiac output represented as the light green curve. The vertical axis, the y-axis, representing the mean systemic filling pressure, which is the pressure pushing the blood from the central veins to the right atrium. Mean systemic filling pressure in the veins, in the central veins, should be higher than the right atrial pressure. If they are equal, it means that the venous return should stop. And you have in the x-axis the right atrial pressure. Right atrial pressure can be 0, can be 5, and can be negative. It is really related to the pleural pressure, which is in the normal breathing is negative pressure, and the mechanical ventilation could be close to 0 pressure. So if you have the right atrial pressure is increasing due to any reason, it could be due to increased intrathoracic pressure or due to pulmonary hypertension. When you have high pressure in the right side of the heart, if the right atrial pressure reached the mean systemic filling pressure, if they are the same, the venous return will stop. There is no venous return. And cardiac output, once the heart reach the filling, reasonable filling by the venous return, is equilibrium point here when the venous return meet with the cardiac output. So the amount came to the heart, to the right atrium as a venous return, typically ejected as a cardiac output or stroke volume. So cardiac output per minute, but stroke volume per just one cardiac cycle. So the amount received should be equal to the amount ejected in normal situation. And the amount of blood represented as this triangle here, the blue triangle. Both sides should be equal, and they have in the middle here equilibrium. When you have the venous return curve is typically the same like cardiac output curve. Okay. The first abnormal pattern, when you have venous return and the cardiac output decrease due to myocardial dysfunction. When you have the venous return it's unaffected, still okay, but the heart cannot push the venous return as a cardiac output due to myocardial dysfunction. This might happen in two main conditions with high resistance, and another two conditions with normal or low resistance. Two conditions with high resistance, it means that high afterload. So the heart is contracting against high afterload or high resistance. And this can happen in preterm infants just after birth due to failure of postnatal adaptation. So it is typically failure of myocardial adaptation to sudden increase in the resistance after birth, after separation of low resistant placenta circulation. And this typically happens in very premature infants, like less than 27 weeks, and not all of them. And this should be well tolerated in term infants. The other condition could be pulmonary hypertension with right ventricular dysfunction. In pulmonary hypertension, you have the right ventricle contracting against high resistance, high pulmonary resistance. In this condition, the right atrial pressure will be high, and once the right atrial pressure started to be higher than the mean systemic filling pressure, then the venous return will stop, and the blood now will be accumulating just behind the heart, just behind the right atrium. So you have the blood keep accumulating in this compartment here, and the ejected volume of the blood as a cardiac output is really small. So typically you have in this condition low cardiac output. So the first two related to high resistance. Another example which is uncommon nowadays because of the decreased trend of PD ligation, it can happen post PD ligation because sudden increase in the resistance after PD ligation, decrease in the filling of the heart, and sudden increase in the resistance. So 6 to 8 hours after ligation, the infant might develop myocardial dysfunction. So it will happen according to the same physiology. You have another two conditions with normal or low resistance. So the resistance in these two conditions should be with a normal or even low. Arrhythmia with myocardial dysfunction. Is the heart exposed to like arrhythmia for a long time because of the there is no enough filling time for the heart, then the blood will accumulate behind the heart, and the dysfunction will develop because of the decreased filling volume, or can happen due to late septic shock. Usually in early septic shock, the resistance will drop without significant impact on the myocardial performance. But once you have significant acidosis and worsening of the septic shock, at the end you may have also myocardial dysfunction. So again, you have two conditions with high resistance and high afterload, and another two conditions with low resistance. In this condition, you have the total body blood volume is normal, but abnormally distributed. So you have overall volume of the blood on the body should not be affected, but it is not distributed and not properly pushed through the heart. In this condition, you don't have to give a lot of fluids. what you need to just to correct the physiology. You have to either decrease the pulmonary vascular resistance by pulmonary vasodilator, number one. Failure of adaptation, you may need to consider proper inotropic support and the vasodilators. In arrhythmia, treat the arrhythmia. In late septic shock, also you need to support the cardiovascular system by dual medication like epinephrine. But you don't have to overload the body by a lot of fluids in this condition. Again, that's the same normal example as a template, and we have the second abnormal pattern, which is a third overall pattern after normal and the first described abnormal pattern. Venous return and the cardiac output with low venous return. And in this condition, you have low mean systemic filling pressure. The pressure in the central veins decreased. Or if you have high resistance to the venous return. So in this condition, you have very low venous return, significantly decreased. And the heart in this condition might even work hyperdynamic. So you have the heart either normal or hyperdynamic. So the volume here is actually in front of the heart, not behind the heart. So it is mainly in the arterial and the capillary compartment more than the venous compartment. In this condition, you have venous return is inadequate to fill the contracting ventricle. One of the examples here, inappropriate and very common example, inappropriate use of inotropes. So if you are using inotropes not indicated, or using very high dose of inotropes, so the heart will contract and the diastolic filling of the heart will decrease. So there is not enough blood in the venous compartment to satisfy the over-contracting ventricle. One of the common examples. If you have an infant on high dose of dobutamine, unnecessarily you may have the heart is empty and most of the blood is actually in the circulation in front of the heart. Or you have significant vasodilatation. In this condition, you have the loss of systemic vascular resistance. That could be also iatrogenic. So if you are using an inappropriate dose of vasodilators, the blood pressure might drop and significant vasodilatation of the arteriolar compartment, and the blood will be stagnant in the arterial or arteriolar compartment of the circulation. If you have high resistance to venous return, the best common example, if you have intra-abdominal pressure increased, like in case of gastroschisis after reduction, or intrathoracic pressure increased, you have significant increase in the mean airway pressure, compressing the venous return. So you have the venous return decreased significantly. And in this condition, the heart is contracting well, but there is not enough filling of the heart. The total body volume is normal, but abnormally distributed. Again, fluids can be used cautiously to refill the heart, and just cautiously. And then you have to deal with the pathophysiologic mechanism, either to wean or to discontinue the inappropriate medication, and to correct septic shock by giving vasopressor, not the inotropes. The next example, when we have venous return and the cardiac output in severe hypovolemia. That's really uncommon condition. You need infant with significant loss of blood or loss of volume to be presented with compromised hemodynamics due to severe hypovolemia. In this kind of example here, you have the venous return low, and you have the cardiac output low. So if the triangle representing the venous return is low, and you have the cardiac output or stroke volume is really low. So that's very straightforward, easy to understand. You have no issue with the right atrial pressure. You have no issue with the filling pressure, but the volume itself, and the heart should be contracting well. What you need to give just volume. Losses outside the venous or vascular system in acute hemorrhage, or it could be in the third space losses. And they have one of the case scenarios. And what you need to do or to give is just give fluids until the capillary permeability improved. You may need to consider steroids to improve the permeability, but giving vasopressors or inotropes might worsen the condition instead of helping the condition. So fluid in this example is the only indicated intervention. It could be fluid as normal saline boluses, or can be as blood if you have significant loss of blood or a significant decrease in hemoglobin. What's the situation if you have hemodynamically significant PDA? So typically have the stroke volume from the left ventricle is low. So the blood going to the systemic circulation is low. And you have the significant amount of blood keeps circulating through the pulmonary circulation, coming back to the right, to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and keep circulating through the PDA again and again. So you have the heart, especially the left side, overloaded, volume overloaded, because the blood keeps circulating, but the amount of blood to the systemic circulation is low. That's why if you're able to measure the right ventricle output accurately, it is a pre-ductal volume, so it is representing the systemic cardiac output more than the left side. Left cardiac output is representing the pulmonary circulation, the QP. But the right ventricle output is represented the QS, the systemic, because of the volume of blood before the connection between the aorta and the pulmonary through the PDA. So the heart is hyperdynamic. You have higher systole than usual, and you have backflow to the pulmonary circulation and diastole. That's why you have big discrepancy between systole and diastole. So the blood is escaping through the PDA from the systemic to pulmonary. And remember that in the diastolic blood pressure representing the systemic vascular resistance and overall volume of the blood. In this situation, you don't have any problem with the systemic vascular resistance. The problem is the volume. That's why the diastolic blood pressure will drop in this condition. It is typically because of the exaggerated elastic recoil of the aorta. And the elastic recoil will push more blood in the wrong direction, instead of to the systemic circulation will be pushed to the pulmonary circulation. Overall, systemic flow is lower, mainly in diastole. The pathophysiologic categories of circulatory shock. We have 4 main categories, and the categories is based mainly on the blood pressure trends. So what you need to do is just look carefully to the blood pressure trends over a period of time. The period of time can be 1 hour up to 24 hours, or can be as back as 48 hours. You can get that easily from the monitor at the bedside. The first category is easy and straightforward. And probably you don't have to confirm that by echocardiography. If you look at the trend, you might be considering the management easy, even if you don't have echocardiography available. Why? Because in this situation, you don't have a problem with the stroke volume or venous return or cardiac performance. You have a problem with the systemic vascular resistance. Will be presented easily on the trend. So that's the first example: low systemic vascular resistance, peripheral vasodilatation, and systemic inflammatory response syndrome, or could be iatrogenic. Iatrogenic, the most common iatrogenic causes of loss of vascular resistance, morphia drugs. If you're using morphine at the bedside in higher doses, especially infusions, it might drop the systemic vascular resistance. What you need to do is just back up on the dose instead of adding more or using vasopressors. Or if you are using vasodilators like Merinon or sildenafil for pulmonary hypertension, If you are using these medications on top of low systemic vascular resistance, then the blood pressure might drop even further. The most common mechanism in low blood pressure is low systemic vascular resistance. And the explanation of that, myocardial muscle is more tolerant to changes in the pH and hypoxia compared to pulmonary and systemic vasculature. So you have any fluctuation in the pH or with the acidosis, you may have significant changes in the systemic vascular resistance, which might drop. And the pulmonary vascular resistance will be the opposite. With the acidosis and with hypoxemia, pulmonary vascular resistance will increase. So in this example here, you have a blood pressure trend over a period of time. And typically you have the blood pressure tracing started at 3:30 up to 7 o'clock. And you have three lines. The bottom line is the diastole, the middle is the mean blood pressure, and the top is systole. And the red color is reflecting the pulse pressure. So if you put the cursor here at any time, at any point, you will get the blood pressure at three numbers. The systolic blood pressure dash the diastole, and between brackets you have the mean blood pressure. The difference between systolic and diastolic, you have the pulse pressure. So in this typical example, what I can conclude easily, so you have the trend of the blood pressure is going down, started at 5 o'clock and to continue to be low up to 7 o'clock, and the trends continue to drop. Roughly, if you have drop of the trend more than 5 milliliter mercury per hour, that's significant drop. You don't have to wait long time until you get the lactic acidosis in this infant, and you should consider to support this infant typically by vasopressor. There is no any rule of inotropic support, because you have normal pulse pressure. It means that you have normal systolic volume, you have normal venous return, and you should have normal contractility. You have pulse pressure in this 1-day-old infant is more than 15 millimeter mercury. Example number 2, or category number 2, low preload. When you have low preload, definition of preload, simply it is the diastolic filling of the ventricle until reaching the physiologic end diastolic volume. So at end systolic volume, you have the minimal amount of blood staying in the ventricle at the end of the systole, and then the heart will continue to fill until reaching the diastolic end diastolic volume. If you have end diastolic volume lower than normal, then it is low filling of the heart due to the amount of reaching the heart is low, which is a preload. Expected in severe hypovolemia, severe pulmonary hypertension. Why? As we mentioned before, if they have the right atrial pressure high, then the right atrial pressure might be even higher than the filling pressure, the systemic venous filling pressure. Then the venous return will stop or will be very minimal. Or if you have external compression by high mean airway pressure or tension pneumothorax, or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. One of the examples is not very common, but one of the examples that should be considered if you have such kind of category or pathophysiology. In this situation, you have low systole, you have normal or low diastolic pressure, and definitely narrow pulse pressure, typically like this example here. So you have the blood pressure was normal for a period of time, and exactly at 10 o'clock, the blood pressure dropped, and it dropped in the form of mainly pulse pressure. So you have all the three lines became almost one line, and the pulse pressure is very low here, less than 5 millimeter mercury. That's 1 day preterm infant. So this blood pressure stayed low between 10 o'clock until 3 p.m. because everyone kept looking just at the mean blood pressure. So everyone missed the pathophysiology in this example. Because of wide list of differential diagnosis, you need, in this example, to do an echocardiography, because it could be pulmonary hypertension, it could be hypovolemia, or could be compressed heart by high mean air pressure. So the most important feature in this category, narrow pulse pressure. Category number 3, when you have high afterload. Definition of high afterload. The afterload is a contractile work load that the ventricle should perform to overcome the resistance. We mentioned that before. So typically in this case you have high diastole because you have high resistance, and the resistance should be reflected on the diastolic blood pressure. So typically you have high diastole, and the high diastole should be overcome by the heart contraction to maintain normal circulation. But sometimes, because of the very mature heart, or even in term infant, might not tolerate that high resistance. Expected in failure of adaptation in premature infants after birth, failure of postnatal transition. Also, that's after birth failure of adaptation can be also due to post-PD ligation syndrome. That's a typical pattern in this pathophysiologic category. The blood pressure was normal for a period of time when this premature infants about 30-weeker gestation age, and then the diastolic blood pressure increased. In this situation, you have typically normal mean blood pressure, and even if you look at each number separate, you will comment that everything should be okay, normal. But the blood pressure is very narrow here, 5 to 10 millimeter mercury. Typically, you have high diastole, and the heart is contracting and is high diastole or high resistance. After some time, might not tolerate that and might be presented as narrow pulse pressure. Echo is highly recommended. That might happen also in pulmonary hypertension because the resistance might be combined, might be systemic high resistance and pulmonary high resistance. So we need to give a medication which can help both lowering systemic vascular resistance and lowering pulmonary vascular resistance at the same time, like Marinon, for example. So there is any role of vasopressor in this condition. Category number 4, if you have poor myocardial performance, typically you have low stroke volume. Definition: impaired ventricular contractility against low or normal vascular resistance. The difference between number 3 and number 4. Number 3 is high afterload, so contraction against high resistance. Number 4, contraction against normal or low resistance. Expected in advanced shock due to systemic inflammatory response. If you have almost irreversible shock at the end, the heart might decompensate, as well as the entire cardiovascular system. Cardiomyopathy and prolonged arrhythmia. Resistance should be normal or low in this condition. Typically in this condition, you have everything low. Decreased systole, decreased diastole, normal pulse pressure. Again, you have echo. In this situation, highly recommended. And to make it easy, I have clinical tips that if you have low blood pressure, parameters, systole, mean blood pressure, diastole, but with normal pulse pressure, like in category 1, you may treat this infant even without echocardiography. Target neonatal echo. This condition, typically the heart should be normal with even hyperdynamic myocardial performance. You have normal venous return, but you have low systemic vascular resistance. So you need to correct the resistance by adding vasopressor, not any troops. And vasopressor is either vasopressin or norepinephrine. Vasopressor in this condition is appropriate support. If you have normal pulse pressure, like category 2 and 3, you have a wide range of hemodynamics issues, including pulmonary hypertension, including myocardial dysfunction, cardiomyopathy, including hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which you cannot diagnose without echocardiography. Then you have to consider targeted neonatal echo once you have narrow pulse pressure. Now we'll discuss the clinical categories of circulatory shock. And typically we have three main categories. Category number 1, when you have low peripheral vascular resistance, which is consistent with category number 1 pathophysiology. Blood pressure components are low systemic, systolic, low systemic diastolic, and mean blood pressure with normal pulse pressure. Drop of blood pressure in this condition, if you have it more than 5 milliliter mercury per hour, that's really significant. And if you have the trend continuously dropping, you don't have to wait long time before considering to support this infant with vasopressor, not inotropes. Or if you have drop of blood pressure consistent with this pattern, and at the same time you have low urine output, or the lactic acid started to increase, then you don't have to wait long time. Then you have to consider supporting this infant with vasopressor. I'll just give you this example, which a condition that you don't have to do anything. There's a preterm infant, 23-weeker, first few hours after birth. You have the blood pressure around 31 systolic over 18 diastolic, mean of 23. So you have the trend is plateau. This few hours of age, if you look at the number of mean blood pressure, you may consider it low, 23 weeker. And this infant, you cannot rely on renal output, is still very early after birth. There was no any lactic acidosis. But you have the blood pressure plateau. You don't have to do anything. You just to watch him clinically. So one of our colleagues considered to give him bolus of normal saline. And bolus of normal saline just increased the blood pressure significantly for half an hour. For 23-weeker infant, for the first few hours after birth, this can be easily associated with development of IVH. And the blood pressure stayed high for almost half an hour and dropped again, because the body compensated to that by what's called a delayed relaxation. Delayed relaxation of the venous compartment will relax more to accommodate for the extra volume of blood. But that happened actually after a significant increase in the blood pressure. And this significant increase was fragile. Choroid plexus might be associated with IVH. So you have to avoid this kind of approach. When you have a plateau blood pressure, no lactic acidosis, then watch the trend without considering any management, even bolus of normal saline. In this premature infant, the blood pressure was low. And then one of our colleagues considered normal of bolus saline, which was associated with just increased in the blood pressure for a transient period of time. You have one bolus, another bolus, and then it started dopamine of 5 milliliter mercury. 5 microgram per kg per minute. So dopamine of 5 do not actually improve the trend of the blood pressure, actually even decrease the trend of the blood pressure. So that's very important to look at the trend after your intervention to see if the intervention was associated with improvement, worsening, or no change. Then you don't have to wait long time. Just 1-2 hours is enough to consider to change your strategy. In this typical example, you have normal pulse pressure and drop of the 3 pressures at the same time. You need to consider vasopressor. So after we shifted the discontinued dopamine and shifted to vasopressin, you can see the blood pressure trend improved. Just a very small dose of vasopressin, not add on just replace the medication which did not help by another medication which more fit for this pathophysiology. Intervention with the category number 1, vasopressor. And vasopressor, by definition, norepinephrine, which is basically alpha stimulant, or vasopressin as a first line, or after inadequate response to dopamine. So if you consider dopamine of 5 or up to 10 mics, you don't have to keep escalating that to 15 or 20. If there is no response, just replace the medication with the more makes sense medication helping in the vascular resistance. You may also consider cortisol level if there is no good initial response, and you may consider hydrocortisone because it is very frequent to have premature infant with suprarenal dysfunction, the main reason for low systemic vascular resistance. Category number 2, when you have high ventricular afterload, high systemic vascular resistance, that's typically uncommon scenario. You may see it in NICU and you may miss it very easily because in this condition you have normal blood pressure. But typically you have low to normal systolic blood pressure and the high diastolic blood pressure, reflecting high resistance if you're able to catch this infant early. But if you wait a few hours later, everything will drop, will decompensate. Few hours, maybe one day, maybe overnight, the lactate will increase and you might be hesitant to add any cardiovascular drug because you can see just normal blood pressure. At the end, everything will drop. The pathognomonic marker in this condition is narrowing of pulse pressure. Pulse pressure less than 15 millimeter mercury for preterm, less than 24 hours, or less than 20 millimeter mercury for older than 24 hours should be considered abnormal. This could be associated with low cardiac output due to poor contractility or poor contractility because the heart is facing high resistance. Typically in this example, as I described before, you have narrowing of pulse pressure and sudden increase in diastolic blood pressure. In this condition, when we did echocardiography, the systemic vascular resistance and also pulmonary vascular resistance, both of them were high. So this is a preterm infant, 30 weeker, and 7 days old with lactic acidosis, renal failure on Lasix infusion to keep urine output higher than 1 ml per kg per hour. On high frequency jet ventilation, FI2 was 40%. So in this situation, after we did an echo, there was pulmonary hypertension. And I will just show you the blood pressure trend after adding Merinon. So typically the blood pressure dropped in front of your eye, but that's improvement of the circulation because at this time the diastolic blood pressure dropped, was wide, and the pulse pressure started to widen. So you have normal pulse pressure now, and started to widen more and more over time. Because Merinon is a slow acting drug, so you may get the optimum response after a few hours if you are giving the Merinon without bolus, which is my recommended approach. Try to avoid bolus of Merinon in preterm infants because that's the Merinon is very strong systemic vasodilator. In this category, intervention could be dobutamine as a first line, or after inadequate response to dopamine of 5 to 10 mics per kg per minute. Merinon can be also considered, especially if you have echocardiographic evidence of pulmonary hypertension. Again, cortisol can be considered if you have evidence of suprarenal dysfunction. Category number 3. Category number 3 is the second common category after number 1. The least common is number 2. Category number 3, when you have low cardiac output or myocardial dysfunction with normal or low systemic vascular resistance. So typically you have a weak heart and the contraction is weak. So you have all of the blood pressure parameters are low. Systolic blood pressure is low. But why the diastolic blood pressure is low? The diastolic blood pressure is low. Remember that the initiation of the diastolic blood pressure, it is actually from the heart. So when the heart contracts, the energy stored by the aortic branches with the elastic recoil. The elastic recoil is initiating the diastolic blood pressure and then maintained by the vascular resistance. In this situation, you have weak contracting heart, so the energy to begin with is low, and the stored energy by elastic recoil is considered low. So you have everything low. So low all of the blood pressure parameters, including for sure mean blood pressure and narrow pulse pressure. So in this situation here, you have a 25-weeker preterm infant. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the blood pressure dropped. You have all of the parameters dropped here. 1 day of life. And then the hemodynamic compromise only detected at 3 o'clock because of the lactic acid in the blood gas came about 5 after being very low in the morning. So we looked at the trend and we discovered that this infant has been compromised since morning. And everyone just kept looking at the mean blood pressure, which was okay, but the pulse pressure was almost close to 2 or 3 millimeter mercury. So at 3 o'clock here, we started the support, which was epinephrine. In this condition, it's better to give a medication which is supporting both systolic and diastolic blood pressure, dual medication like epinephrine. Or it could be dopamine. You can try dopamine if you like, but epinephrine, if you have infant with long time compromised, epinephrine might be faster. So the blood pressure normalized after just a small dose of epinephrine in this case scenario. And the dose was actually low, 0.05 mics per kg per minute. So for category number 3, the interventions, the physiologic approach or intervention could be fluid boluses if there is evidence of low systemic venous return or low filling of the heart. If the heart is not filling well, probably you have to prime the heart with enough volume before considering inotropes. Giving inotropes on top of empty heart is not really good for the circulation. Epinephrine as first line or after inadequate response to dopamine of 5 to 10 mics as a maximum. And then you have to shift. If there is no good response, shift to epinephrine. Dopamine is working as vasopressor in the higher dose. So if you increase the dopamine higher, then might not really improve the performance very well. So you may need to consider another fast-acting medication like epinephrine. Metabolic acidosis was high base deficit. For example, if you have pH less than 7.2, then it might be the reason why there is no good response with the cardiovascular support. Then you need to improve the acid base status first before keep escalating the cardiovascular support. Then I have some case scenarios just to make the application much easier to understand. I have case number 1, term infant with HIE, with clinical pulmonary hypertension on nitric oxide. FiO2 was initially 100%, and then after nitric oxide improved to 60%. So there was no response to nitric oxide, but not the expected response. There was high urine output, 10 ml per kg per minute, which is really strange and unexpected for HIE. Lactic acid of 5 millimole per liter. And you have the blood pressure here. The trend of the blood pressure, as we explained in this graph before, is going down with maintained pulse pressure. So this infant was pulmonary hypertension and low systemic vascular resistance, as we can understand easily from the graph now. And it's partially decompensated because the lactic acid started to increase after being dropped after birth. So what's the best medication in this example? It would be vasopressin, because vasopressin will improve the pulmonary circulation, basically because of the improvement of systemic circulation, systemic vascular resistance. So the venous return will also be improved. Will be improved because vasopressin is vasoconstrictor, and vasopressin might be able to help more venous return back to the right atrium. So that's actually the vasopressin started at 8 o'clock, and you can see the response about 15 minutes. The blood pressure trend improved. So by looking at the trend, there is good improvement, and the oxygen requirement came down to about 30%. Urine output improved from 10 ml per kg per hour to almost 2 to 3. So vasopressin improved 3 things at the same time: the systemic circulation, pulmonary circulation, and urine output. The same infant in the morning, the blood pressure trend dropped again with maintained pulse pressure. So at 4 o'clock, the blood pressure trend started to drop, and vasopressin at that time was the same as the started dose, which is 3.03 international unit per kg per minute. But the explanation of that, the pH dropped. So at that time, the blood gas was done at 6 o'clock, showed that the pH of 7.0, CO2 of 85. So what you need to do at that in this situation, don't increase the dose. What you need to do is just improve the acidosis. So after adjusting the ventilation and the pH improved, you can see also the blood pressure improved back to normal. Another HIE, infant on cooling, day 1, urine output of 1 ml per kg, but no acidosis. So in this situation here, you have plateau blood pressure, and here you have plateau blood pressure, normal pulse pressure. It's not the same like the previous example. The dopamine was started at 5 mics, but this infant became hypertensive. Blood pressure 73/50, mean of 60. So that's unnecessary intervention and even harmful, because the aim of cooling in HIE to minimize reperfusion injury. So by sudden increase in the blood pressure, you may cause reperfusion injury to the brain. So if you have a plateau blood pressure, no lactic acidosis, and reasonable urine output, you have to stay tight. You don't have to do anything. Another HIE case. This case was meant to be on cooling. Urine output was low. Lactic acid was 6, which started to increase after being improved after birth. What you can see here, just one line. I cannot see pulse pressure. And the difference between systole and diastole is 7 to 8 millimeter mercury, in spite of having normal mean blood pressure. So if you keep looking at the mean blood pressure equal to gestational age, you may consider that as super normal. But this collapsing infant, he's really collapsed with increasing lactic acid, and he needs to be supported. And the reasonable support in this situation to give dobutamine. So you have low systole, narrow pulse pressure, and there is no significant increase in the diastole. That's normal diastole. So there is no significant increase in the systemic vascular resistance. But this heart might be affected by the significant hypoxic ischemic insult. So after a small dose of dobutamine, the pulse pressure improved. Lessons from case number 1 to 3. HIE and cooling and with low blood pressure. Vasopressin is a good option with low systemic vascular resistance.
Hi, I just put him on the jet. The CO2 is...
You just started.
So again, vasopressin is a good option with low systemic vascular resistance and pulmonary hypertension. Worsening of blood pressure might happen with acidosis. So what you need to do in such case scenario is just to improve the pH. because systemic vascular resistance and also pulmonary vascular resistance, they are very sensitive to changes in the pH with significant acidosis. Dobutamine is a good option with low systole and narrow pulse pressure. And remember, dobutamine should be avoided if you have very low diastole, because the dobutamine is a strong beta stimulant. So if you have both low diastole and low systole, it's preferred to use a dual medication like dopamine or epinephrine. Borderline blood pressure was maintained trend, no acidosis, and acceptable urine output needs just watching without any intervention. And then I have a preterm infant, another case scenario. Preterm male infant born at 25 weeks, gestational age, birth weight 620 grams. The clinical course was complicated by development of neck, stage 3, required ileal resection with ileostomy. He developed post-operative anuria with normal blood pressure and significant edema due to third space losses. Despite administration of diuretics for 24 hours, he remained anuric. So the echocardiography, what you can see here, severe underfilling of the heart. So you have the four chamber view, left side of the heart and right side, and that's the end of systole. What you can see just myocardium. There is no any cavity in both ventricles, and the cavity with the blood should be seen as a like more dark or black color. You have just tissues like myocardial tissue. Here, the severe underfilling of the heart. There's the heart actually in parasternal long axis view. At the end of systole, you can see the heart is collapsing. The ventricle is collapsing, almost empty, and you have some pericardial, mild pericardial effusion. When you evaluated the integrated assessment of hemodynamics, the cardiac output was low, and typically it was low because of the low stroke volume. Mean blood pressure was acceptable, but the pulse pressure was low. And the pulse pressure was low, typically because of low stroke volume. Systemic vascular resistance calculated, and you can calculate that by dividing the mean blood pressure by left ventricle output. The typical acceptable systemic vascular resistance in preterm infant is about 150 to 200 millimeter mercury per liter per kg per minute. So that's typically high resistance. And as we mentioned initially, that the body will compensate for low volume by increasing the resistance. In this case, the infant still compensated because the lactic acid is still acceptable. So the tissue perfusion is still acceptable in this situation. The formulated medical recommendation was to give fluids, and just the fluids. Vasopressor is not indicated because the systemic vascular resistance is already high. Inotropes is very dangerous to give it, to give any kind of inotropes in case of empty heart. So you will compromise the filling more by doing that. So just the fluids and the fluids, and generous giving of fluids in spite of this infant was very edematous and keep losing the fluid in the third space. So give the fluids until the heart started to be filled with reasonable stroke volume. And so the formulated medical recommendation was to give fluids and also to consider steroids to control loss of fluids to the third space, like trying to improve the capillary permeability. No cardiovascular medication used. This infant recovered in 48 hours. So we started to see good heart filling in about 48 hours and improved urine output after that. And it took about 7 days for the edema to improve. After improvement of the cardiovascular filling and heart filling, now you may consider using the Lasix to improve the systemic edema. So we are now moving away from non-physiologic practice. I'll just give you an example which kind of history in our physiologic approach. You have a preterm infant, 18 days old, developed hypotension followed by lactic acidosis, started dopamine of 5 mics per kg per minute, and then now because of worsening acidosis and worsening of blood pressure, increased to 10, and then added dopamine of 5, and then increased to 10, and both of them at 20, worsening of blood pressure. As you ask a cardiologist to check with you, and he said that everything is okay regarding the heart performance. And then you added epinephrine, and then he developed a reversible shock, and he died at the end because we are not sure what was a physiologic or pathophysiologic mechanism. We just keep adding medications, and medications actually might worsen the condition instead of helping, instead of give a chance for the infant to improve by himself. So that's kind of history in our approach. Just to conclude, your approach, the physiologic approach, should look at the trend of systolic, diastolic, and pulse pressures before and after any deterioration and interventions. Compare the values to the normalized centile curves for post-menstrual age. Integrate the impression from systolic and diastolic pressure with other parameters like urine output, acidosis, mean aerobic pressure, fluid status, hemoglobin, oxygen requirement, and the peripheral perfusions. So that's a value of integrating the hemodynamics to the other parameters related to end organ performance. It changes your formulated recommendation if there is no improvement after 1 to 2 hours. You don't have to wait very long time before considering to change your strategy. Or if there is worsening at any time, don't wait. It means that your approach is not the physiologic, you need to change it. Some categories of circulatory shock cannot be successfully managed without echocardiography. As we mentioned before, in some situations you have to consider early targeted neonatal echo. After improving of all parameters and start weaning the medication, at that point you may rely on mean blood pressure. Because if you have normalized systolic and diastolic, the mean blood pressure will be truly reflecting the improvement. Then you may start weaning based on the mean blood pressure to make your life easier for weaning. Thank you.